All right. So, hello and welcome to the next lecture in the ongoing series of lectures in pre-press Repro techniques. We were uh, discussing the module on color reproduction and correction. So, perhaps in the last lecture, we started our discussion on achieving gray balance. We did not discuss actually achieving the process of gray balance, but we discussed what gray balance was and why it is essential to maintain or achieve gray balance during color reproduction and why it is important. What are our goals, especially while maintaining, uh, what are our goals during the color reproduction work, especially we described two goals, two primary goals. One is definitely getting the correct tone reproduction, and second, of course, getting the gray balance right, gray balance correct. So today we will be discussing primarily on we will be considering a scenario, hypothetical if you may, and from that point onwards we will establish a methodology through which we can uh, assess the nature of reproduction in terms of its gray balance, and definitely later on we'll be establishing some mechanism using which we can achieve gray balance in our color reproduction. So that is basically the goal for today's lecture. Okay, and so let us begin our discussion primarily with one important terminology when we talk about gray balance, that is END. So I mean, don't think that this is the end of the lecture, but END basically stands for equivalent neutral density. All right. So now the question is, what is equivalent neutral density? That we have to understand first. Equivalent neutral density, or END, refers to the densities of individual process inks, that is the cyan, magenta and yellow inks, that produces a neutral gray. Okay. So for example, the image that you see in front of you, what I would like you to consider is uh, we are going to omit the black channel right now and consider that this is a reproduction using the three colors, cyan, magenta and yellow colors, right? So equivalent neutral density is the density of the cyan ink, density of the magenta ink and density of the yellow inks respectively that are used for printing this three color separation or this three color reproduction, such that the grays in this reproduction remains neutral in nature. That means there is no hue shift in any particular direction. Okay, so that is what END is, and this is a metric using which we can achieve gray balance. Okay, so our aim, our objective over here is to calculate the ENDs for cyan, magenta and yellow inks in a three color reproduction, such that the resulting overlap gray areas are neutral in nature, hence gray balance can be maintained. So that is primarily our goal in this entire endeavor, in this entire process that we are going to discuss today. So the question is, how do I achieve this, right? Now also, another important thing that I would like to just focus here, actually right at the beginning, in fact, it is that now this the concept of END uh, is widely used in various calibration techniques. So I don't think you know what calibration is. Calibration is identification of the native behavior of any device, okay, and thereby changing it to behave in a linear way, right? So that is essentially what calibration is. So one such very popular calibration technique today that is being used is known as the G7 technique. So it is gray plus the seven solids, that is C, M, Y, K, as well as R, G and B, right? So these are the that is one technique that is used for calibration of print devices. The concept, the basic premise of this G7 technique is to ensure that all the images in the different types of devices that we're using to visualize the image, be it in a monitor, be it in a printer or whatever, they all share a equivalence in appearance. Okay, that is known as the shared equivalent appearance. Uh, One of the primary goals there is to achieve gray balance. In this technique, actually, so I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on this technique. We will discuss some of the theoretical aspects of G7 calibration in our elective class, but nonetheless, we do have we can definitely discuss the basic premise on which this is developed. So there are a lot of things to consider over here, like reference printing conditions, um, differences between how chromatic black and achromatic black or grays are being reproduced by the printing system. But the fundamental concept that is central to the process of G7 calibration uh, is contained in one or two curves. They are known as the NPDC curves, or neutral print density curves. The work for G7 calibration is to ensure that these curves are uh, they are overlapping with each other and they are linear in nature. So that is how the gray balance is maintained over there, right? Linearization or calibration is just one part basically of your entire press standardization process. So it's the first step. uh, G7 only deals with the first step only, that is they do not what we call print to numbers, they do not characterize devices. Okay, they only calibrate devices. They linearize the tone responses of the that is obtained from the particular device. Especially, they ensure that all the images share the same neutral appearance by ensuring that the NPDC curves are linear. The flexibility of a G7 tolerancing method or this G7 calibration method is that it is independent of what type of ink you are using, what type of printing machine you have, what type of paper you are using, what type of consumables you are having. So these factors are not going to impact that, and it's a very dynamic process, and the primary goal there is basically to linearize these curves no matter what your inputs are. So process control is achieved in a very dynamic method. But on the other hand, on the other end of the spectrum, we have other methodologies. They are actually, you can say, truly standardization techniques. G7 is not a complete standardization technique, it's only a calibration technique. The other end of the spectrum contains the ISO techniques based on 12647 and most recently 15339. So these basically are standards which ensure process control is achieved via three methods. One is calibration, characterization, and finally conversion. So we'll get to all these techniques later on in our later classes maybe. But I just wanted to talk a little bit, give a little bit of idea about this or draw a parallel between the concept of END and how even today the philosophy of that concept is today even used in various calibration techniques, because the core fundamental of that concept remains the same even today. So we will see something which is, you can say, maybe analogous to the NPDC curve, but it is not really the same. But we will see, because NPDC curves takes into account various other parameters also, which in this scenario we are not taking into account. Okay, so let us see how this is achieved. So first of all, the problem, we have to define the problem, and then we have to identify why such a problem has occurred and how to solve the problem. So this is basically the fundamental in answering any such question, right? So what the problem is, right, why the problem has occurred, right, and how to solve the problem. These three words are key to analyze and solve any particular problem that you might face in the industry. So in our case, what is the problem? Let us consider a hypothetical. Okay, So we have printed, right? We have printed with three colors, and after printing, we have seen that the grays are no longer neutral in nature. They have shifted in appearance. That is, there has been a huge shift in the image. Maybe red side, green side, whatever. It's appearing. The gray may be appearing brownish in nature. Normally, if you do not maintain gray balance and if you do not take into account the deficiencies of the cyaning, then definitely the gray that you are going to get is basically a brownish kind of a gray. It's not really neutral gray; it's brownish gray. I think it was also visible in the ECI gray control strip. If you remember the earlier one I showed you, I think it was not brownish. There was a huge shift towards the blue side, I think. So having said and done all this, the problem here is that we have printed with our three processings, that is cyan, magenta and yellow, and the resulting image over here, let us assume that such an image is giving us non-neutral gray, right? That means there has been a huge shift in the gray. That means gray balance is no longer maintained over there. So because we have not basically taken into account anything, and simply we have printed depending upon the original, and the resulting image is having non-balanced or non-neutral gray, right? So definitely now our work is to find out why this is happening. What the problem is, that we have already defined, that there is no gray balance, that we are getting non-neutral grays. Now why this problem is happening? It is happening because of a multitude of problems, right? Because of the hue deficiencies of the ink, because of the ink film thickness, because of the dot percentage, because of your printing system, because of your the various other consumables that you may be using during the print production process. So because of all these reasons, this problem might occur, right? Now what you have to do in order to solve the problem, now why is also clear to us, because what are the how did I say why this problem is happening? I have already showed you in the previous lecture only that what are some of the controlling factors that impact the gray balance and its control. So from that I analyzed and came to the conclusion that why it is happening. So most likely event why it is happening is that the densities of cyan ink is the difference of densities between the cyan ink and magenta ink and cyan ink and yellow ink is not that much. We want that the density of cyan ink and difference of densities in cyan ink and magenta ink is quite high, right? That means for greater portion of the greater portion of the cyan, we need lower amount of magenta and lower portion of yellow. So the quantity or the dot percentages of your cyan ink has to be higher in comparison to your magenta and yellow. That is our you can say preliminary analysis of the problem and how to solve it, right? Now your work is basically to find out the END values. So how did I define the END values? I said the END values, or the you can say the equivalent neutral densities, are the densities for the cyan separation, magenta separation and the yellow separations, for which when we combine them on top of each other, the resultant gray that is obtained is neutral. So we need to find out, now listen to this very carefully, we need to find out the densities for which this we can of the cyan, magenta and yellow inks, for which we can get a neutral gray, right? Now from the if you just correlate between your our earlier lectures on how to achieve the optimal tone reproduction, you would remember there that we had used or we had taken the help of the Jones diagram. If you remember that, what we did, we first of all tried to find out the optimal tone reproduction curve, and then from that point on we derived how much dot percentage is required in the plate to reproduce the same on the paper, density on the paper, and ultimately how much dot percentage in the film on the negative is required to reproduce the same in the plate and ultimately on the paper, right? So using Jones diagram we obtained those values. We will apply a very similar technique, not the Jones diagram, but a very similar technique here fundamentally, which, keeping that concept in mind, we will use one of the techniques. There are actually multiple techniques to find out the ENDs, but the technique that we are using is very similar to the one that we had seen earlier for obtaining the optimal tone reproduction dot percentages. So our goal here is basically to find out what will be the optimal dot percentages of the cyan, magenta and yellow inks for which we are going to get a combination density of the gray such that the gray is neutral in nature, ensuring gray balances occurred. So let me break it down a little bit further. So what I'm trying to say is that, so here let us see, these are all gray scales, right? This is the gray scale for cyan, this is for magenta, this is for yellow. Now think about this point in the grayscale, right? This particular point in all of the grayscales, basically the same point. I am saying what will be the dot percentage of the this patch in each of the cyan, magenta and yellow grayscale, such that when we overlap them on top of each other, the resulting gray that we are getting is basically neutral in nature, right? Neutral in nature. Now listen to this very carefully. I said that I want to obtain the optimal dot percentages of the cyan, magenta and yellow inks so that when we overlap them on top of each other, the resulting gray is neutral in nature. But when I began my analysis, I talked about something known as equivalent neutral density. But here I'm talking about dot percentages. So you might ask, okay, what is, how come you're not talking about densities and you're talking only about the dot percentages? Yeah, very good question. If somebody has this question in their minds, the reason is in the previous Jones diagram also we saw that we actually kind of uh, how do I say, we correlated, not equated, but we correlated the dot percentages or the densities with against the dot percentages. That means we wanted to find out, in order to obtain this much density, how much dot percentage of the cyan, magenta and yellow is required. If you remember our earlier Jones diagram figure, we saw in the in the first quadrant we had the 4 color reproduction and your 3 color reproduction, as well as various other curves like this. So for a 3 color reproduction, for a density like this, we found out, in order to reproduce this particular density, how much amount of dot is reproduced, has to be reproduced on the plate, how much of the same has to be reproduced on the film or the negative. So, for the cyan separation, magenta separation and yellow separation respectively. Alright, so that is why I am saying basically that we are trying to correlate densities here with the dot percentages. So we can use, when we are talking about dot percentages, our result will be in dot percentages. What result? That means what was our initial problem statement? Our problem statement is to find out that for what densities of the cyan, magenta and yellow, the overlapping and when they're overlapped on top of each other, the resulting gray is a neutral one. That was our initial problem statement. Now we are going to change the density of cyan, magenta, yellow with the dot percentages, because they're analogous to each other, right? They vary proportionately with each other, right? So that means what? That means that when we are talking about dot percentage, when we are talking about finding out the neutral density, ultimately what we are talking about is how much percentage, how much dot percentage of cyan, how much dot percentage of magenta and how much dot percentage of yellow is required to reproduce a particular shade of neutral gray, particular percentage of neutral gray, right? So that is our problem statement, and let us see now how do we solve that problem. This much is, hopefully I hope it is clear, this much is clear. Okay, now let us move on to the method using which we can achieve this. So this curve may seem familiar because we have already seen this type of curves in our earlier Jones diagram. This is not a Jones diagram, obviously, as you can say, as you can see from this plot, but I think the core philosophy remains the same, that we want to find out for what dot percentages of certain inks we are able to get certain densities. Okay, so that is our premise. So now what we have to do, see, let us understand the problem, let us understand the process actually. Okay, so what we have done really, if we go back to the earlier slide also, we have printed two things. So let me just clear all this out, so I'll be able to write some additional information. Okay, so what we have done really over here is we have printed total of 4 sheets of paper. Okay, we have printed 4 sheets of paper. Okay, so what are these 4 sheets of paper? The first sheet of paper contains your 3 color image, right? Containing cyan, magenta and yellow inks, right? The second sheet of paper contains only, so let me write 3 colors, otherwise CC it will be confusing. Second sheet contains the image of only the cyan areas. That means this is printed only using the cyan ink along with a grayscale of the cyan separation. The third image contains the only the magenta areas printed using the magenta ink. Similarly, there is a grayscale, and the fourth image is printed using the yellow ink along with the grayscale of the yellow ink or yellow separation, right? So we have printed 4 sheets of paper. What is our goal? We know our problem was that there is the problem of non-neutral gray. We have seen that the grays over here have shifted towards any color, maybe brown, red, blue, whatever, right? Our aim is to achieve gray balance, right? Our aim is to achieve gray balance. In order to achieve gray balance, this is our problem statement, this is our aim, and this is basically the process, right? Is it clear? Now what we have to do, let us check. The first thing that you have to do is you have to plot, and similarly actually I should have given over here, there is another grayscale over here which contains the grayscale for the 3 colors overlapping on each other. That means this is basically ultimately a grayscale. The nature of the of this particular grayscale, if this is producing non-neutral gray, will not be like this. It will not be like this. It will be maybe towards the bluer side or maybe towards the redder side, whatever it will be, right? I hope I'm clear now. Okay, so let me just add that and I'll just come back. Okay, let me just add that grayscale that you're obtaining in the 3 color separation actually. Yes, so see, I have added one grayscale. Let me just clear this area out. Okay, I'll just clear this area out. Okay, so this is another grayscale. This is actually the grayscale that is obtained in the 3 color combination sheet. Now it is quite visible from this particular sheet that the grayscale, the grays are no longer neutral and it has shifted towards the red side, or it has become brownish basically. It should have been like this. This should have been the ideal neutral grayscale, but it is actually becoming like this after printing with all the 3 colors, right? So this is the problem is there is non-neutral gray, and our aim is to achieve gray balance. Our aim is to create a neutral gray, something which will appear like this. And what we have done, first we have printed 4 sheets of paper. What are these 4 sheets? First is a 3 color combination, second is only a sheet containing only the cyan areas, third is the sheet containing only the magenta areas, fourth is the sheet containing only the yellow areas. All right, so this is what we have done. Now let us check what we have to do next. The first thing that we have to do is we have to plot the densities obtained from each of the color separations against the densities obtained for the 3 color combination. That means this grayscale is having certain densities for each of the patch, right? So many grayscales are there. Similarly, for the cyan, for the magenta, individual grayscales are there, and similarly for the 3 color separation also, each of the patch is having some density. So you have to plot the densities of the cyan separation versus the density of the 3 color separation using the same filter. Remember, using the same filter, if you are plotting the densities of the cyan areas versus that of the 3 color combination, then you have to use the red filter in the densitometer for measurement of the data, for measurement of the density. For measurement of densities of the in the magenta ink, then you have to use the green filter, and for yellow ink density measurement, you have to use the blue filter in your densitometer as well as in the three color combination while measuring the or comparing the densities. This much is clear. So if we do this, then we are most likely to get a plot of this nature, something of this nature. Don't be very much concerned about the nature of the lines and all. Just try to understand this, what this curve or what this plot represents. See, along the y-axis, what do we have? We have single color press sheets, dr meaning density of the cyan through red filter, density of magenta through green filter, density of yellow through blue filter, versus the three color, versus this much, versus the three color press sheet through the red filter. When why through red filter? Because we first measured the cyan separation, then through green filter, that is for the magenta separation, magenta sheet, and then through the blue filter for the yellow sheet. Okay, so you get the comparison for the densities of the individual sheet versus the density of the combination sheet through three different filters, and you get all the plots from the grayscales, and you join all the points to obtain curves like this. Okay, this is the first step that you have to do. This is the first step you have to do. In the second step, what you have to do is basically take another plot. I mean, I understand that these plots are actually joined, but initially these plots won't be joined. You have to take another graphing paper altogether, and then in that graphing paper, along the negative x-axis, you have to do a kind of a reflection, a laterally reversed kind of a axis over there in order to obtain the negative x-axis. So in that graphing paper, you plot along the negative x-axis dot percentages, not densities but dot percentages. So finding something familiar, something which we had discussed earlier also, maybe. Okay, so in the negative x-axis, we are going to plot the dot percentages, and along the x-axis, of course, the x-axis remains the same. So what does the y-axis remains the same. What data is contained in the y-axis? Y-axis contains the data of the densities of the individual press sheets. Individual meaning the cyan sheet through the red filter densities, magenta sheet densities through the green filter, yellow sheet densities of the grayscale. Densities meaning of the grayscale of this densities of this particular patches, right? So this y-axis basically contains the densities of the individual press sheets of the cyan sheet, magenta sheet, and yellow sheet through red, green, and blue filter respectively, right? Now, what does this dot percentage, that is negative x-axis, mean? Where do we get this dot percentage from? See, each of the each of the color patch in this grayscale, how have they been reproduced? The dot percentage has been changed, right? Maybe the first patch is having 10%, then 12%, then 14%, like this up to maybe 90%. Maybe 90% dot has been reproduced like this. And when we, as I told you earlier also, when we increase the dot percentage, naturally the density also increases because the area coverage increases, ink film thickness increases. So all this, because of all these factors, definitely when we increase the dot percentage of a particular color patch, then definitely the density increases. That is how we create tonal gradation, right? That I hope it is clear from the half tone classes that we had done earlier also. So the negative x-axis contains the dot percentages which are actually printed, not what we are intended it for to be printed. So for example, we had maybe prepared the plate before printing, where the dot percentages were 10%, 12%, 14%, like this. But after printing, we saw there is an overall dot gain. So maybe the 10% became 12%, 12% became 15%, and so on and so forth. So there was dot gain. We have to measure using our dot percentage reader how much of the patches are, how much dot percentages are actually being printed in each of the color patch within the grayscale of each of the press sheet, right? So we have to calculate or not calculate, we have to simply measure the dot percentage of each of these patches for the yellow sheet, for the magenta sheet as well as for the cyan sheet. Okay, now what we have to do, we have to compare the densities of each of the optical densities or reflection densities of each of the patch versus, so optical densities of each of the patch versus the dot percentage of those same patches, right? What does it mean? So for example, let me just uh, write over here in the next slide. So for example, this is our grayscale, right? This is our, let us say, yellow grayscale. Okay, so maybe this is actually after printing, the first patch is having a let us say a dot percentage of 12%. Okay, we have measured it through our dot percentage reader, and then this, what is the corresponding optical density, what is the corresponding optical density of this particular 12% patch, color patch, right? So this we can obtain, we have to compare it and we have to plot those points basically in this second quadrant. Okay, so this is, maybe we have to repeat the experiment, for the cyan patch, for the magenta patch as well as for the yellow patch. So definitely we are going to get three curves. Incidentally, the magenta and yellow have overlapped, curves have overlapped with each other and they are seeming to be the same single curve basically. So ultimately we are getting the comparison or the correlation between the optical densities of individual color patches of the grayscale of a single patch sheet measured through a particular density filter versus the dot percentage of the those same patches for the single patch sheet. Okay, so like that we can connect those points and we can obtain such curves, right? Okay, so the second step is also complete. Now coming to the third step. Now what you have to do, you have got two graph papers. I told you have to plot it separately. You have got two graph papers. Okay, now you have to just combine it together such that the graduation marks, that means the intervals of the y-axis for the first plot as well as for the second plot, they coincide with each other, such that we get a single y plot, single y axis and a positive x axis and a negative x axis. So ultimately the nature of the overall plot, when we combine those two plots, individual two plots together, is something of this nature, right? This much is hopefully clear. Now coming to our ultimate calculation of finding out what is the equivalent neutral densities for cyan, magenta and yellow inks in order to produce a neutral gray of a certain density. Okay, but remember, over here our results will not be in densities, our result will be in dot percentages. Now there is a practical utility of this also. Why do you think we are not calculating the final data, the densities required by the cyan ink, for the cyan ink, magenta ink and yellow ink, not in densities but in dot percentages? Because we are going to print those dots or create those dots. We have a control over the dot size. We do not have a direct control over the densities. We control the densities by changing the dot size. Therefore, in order to calculate the equivalent neutral densities, we need to control the dot percentages, which ultimately control the density for the inks. Okay, so that is why we are going to get the answer in dot percentages and not densities. So we say it is equivalent neutral density. Yes, equivalent neutral density for what? For the gray patch. In order to reproduce the equivalent neutral density for the gray patch, what is the necessary equivalent neutral densities for the cyan ink, magenta ink and yellow ink? That is controlled by the dot percentages. Only when we control the dot percentages, we'll get to find out the densities basically. So in order to calculate this dot percentages, for which the dot percentages of the cyan, magenta and yellow ink, for which we are going to get a neutral gray, what we have to do, now listen to this very carefully. We have to consider a particular density value. So in order to find out how much dot percentage for cyan ink, magenta ink and yellow ink is required to reproduce a neutral gray of a certain density, what is the process we have to follow? See, in this diagram, in this plot, we are considering what is the dot percentage of cyan, magenta and yellow in order to reproduce a gray having a density of 0.8, having an optical density of 0.8, right? Now let us consider what is the required percentage printing dots in the half tone negatives that has to be reproduced during process camera operation for each of the cyan separation, magenta separation and yellow separation, such that the resulting overlap of the inks of those dot percentages leads to a neutral gray having a optical density of 0.8. So what you have to do? You have to just draw a line starting from this point, which is your point of interest at point 8. You simply have to draw a line from the point of the point in the three color press sheet density line, which is your point of interest. So that means you want to find out the dot percentages for the cyan separation negative, magenta separation negative and yellow separation negatives, such that when they combine, when we get plates and ultimately print those dots overlapping on each other, we get a neutral gray having an optical density of 0.8. So in order to find this, what you have to do, you have to draw a line starting from this point and move upwards, right? Now here you will see that this line, as you draw it upwards, this line is hitting or intersecting the already given curves for cyan, magenta, yellow at three different points. So for example, this line is intersecting the curve for the cyan printed sheet here, as well as for the magenta and yellow over here respectively, right? The point from which they intersect these given curves, from those points then you have to shift and you have to draw lines towards the left, right? And then the lines definitely would intersect with the these curves that are present in the second quadrant. These you can see that these lines are intersecting with the cyan inks, cyan dot percentage lines, as well as for the magenta and yellow lines. And as soon as they intersect, as soon as these lines basically intersect with them, what you can do over here, as you can see that the second line I think should have been drawn like this, because this is a little bit different. It should have been this much actually or something similar to this. Okay, so then as soon as these lines that you had drawn moving left from the first quadrant, as soon as they hit the cyan, magenta and yellow curves in the second quadrant, you simply go down, you draw lines downward, and as you draw lines downward, you will be able to find out that these lines which you drew downwards, they are intersecting the negative x-axis. What is there in the negative x-axis? The percentage printing dots are there in the negative axis. So that means you have found out essentially that in order to reproduce a neutral gray having an overall density of 0.8, how much dot percentage for cyan, how much dot percentage for magenta, and how much dot percentage for yellow is basically required to be reproduced in your negative separations, channel separations, for them to be printed and overlap to get a neutral print density of neutral gray density of 0.8, right? So for example, here you have got 75% cyan, here you have got maybe 65% magenta and maybe 60% of yellow. So if you know that if you, in order to get an area of gray which is having a neutral density of 0.8, that area has to be reproduced by obtaining 75% dot of cyan in your cyan separation negative, 65% magenta in your magenta separation negative, and 60% dot in your yellow separation negative. When these separation negatives are used together to create plates, different plates, ultimately what will happen when they overlap with each other, the resulting gray that will be formed is not only a neutral gray, but the density of such a gray will be 0.8 neutral gray. Okay, so this is the methodology using which we can basically find out the required dot percentages for creating a neutral gray of a certain density. Okay, this is how we can find out the equivalent neutral densities in terms of the printing dot percentages for the three different subtractive primary inks. Now, one question you might ask, but sir, this data that you've just shown, that these plots, these are obtained from a sheet which was initially not gray in nature. It itself was non-neutral in nature. So how come we are using the same plot and the same data in order to obtain the dot percentages of the subtractive primaries to get a neutral gray? Here, one important assumption we are making. What is that assumption? That the gray over here in this particular axis, that is the positive x-axis, all these densities that we obtained in the from the three color print, basically, in regards to that, there is one assumption. What is that assumption? The assumption is that if we take any point in the three color axis, right, three color density axis, maybe this point, or whichever point we are considering, and when we measure the density of the three color pressheet in that particular region for that particular density, the resulting densities from that is obtained from using different color filters, that means red, blue and green filters, will all give the same reading. This you have to understand. Why am I saying this? I said that in order to get a density, if you consider this density neutral gray density of 1.2, then, and if you measure the neutral gray or the gray area having a density of 1.2 in the three color press sheet, and if you measure the densities of that area through the red filter, green filter and blue filter, then the densities will be equal. Now, why am I saying this? Even in the earlier class, even in the earlier lecture, I had given a little bit of introduction to this idea. I had told you about this because you see, how is a gray reproduced? You tell me what is the fundamental method of reproducing a neutral gray, for that matter. Not just any gray, but neutral gray. How is it reproduced? It is reproduced when the densities of obtained through the red filter in the densitometer, through the blue filter in the densitometer, and through the green filter in the densitometer, resulting densities becomes equal to each other. Only then we are able to get the neutral gray in that area. That means what? Consider this. I am saying that in order to get a neutral gray, so for example, we are considering this 0.8 density. So let us assume that maybe an overall density of 0.3 from cyan, 0.3 from magenta and 0.3 from yellow is giving us a overall density of 0.8 in that region. Only when this becomes the truth, that means when we are getting a 0.3 density from the cyan, 0.3 density from the magenta, 0.3 density from the yellow area, that means same densities obtained through the three different filters, red, blue and green filters. Only in those areas, only in areas where the densities through the individual filters becomes equal to each other, that area will be perceived by the densitometer as well as our eyes by a neutral gray. Is it clear or not? Because if equal proportions of light hits our eyes from the red region, green region and blue region of the electromagnetic spectrum, that area will become neutral to our eyes, right? That area is going to become neutral to our eyes, isn't it? So now try to correlate this equality in densities with the inequalities in the dot percentage. Now you can say that, okay sir, you have written 0.3, 0.3, 0.3, that means whatever, the same densities. Don't worry about the 0.3 value, it can be whatever it is. I am saying the only condition for an area to be perceived as a neutral gray by the densitometer or our human eyes is such that the densities of that area through the different filters in the densitometer will be the same to each other. Then how come you are saying that, how come you have obtained different dot percentages of cyan, magenta, yellow to reproduce the same densities? Very interesting area this we have introduced here. What we have said, what we know so far, we know that cyan is filled with anomalies and filled with deficiencies. It is contaminated with magenta and yellow inks, as if, because it is deficient in both blue light as well as green light. So that means if we do not increase the percentage reflection from cyan and reduce the percentage reflection from magenta and yellow, we are not going to get the same densities, because if we maintain the same dot percentages of cyan, magenta, yellow, the densities for the green and blue filters, that means the densities for the magenta and yellow dots, will definitely be higher than the density obtained or the reflections obtained from the cyan dot of the same dot percentage area, isn't it? So in order to obtain this equality in densities, optical densities through the different filters, we are changing or we are modifying the dot percentage areas of the cyan, magenta and yellow, such that, in what way? Such that the densities obtained through the different filters for those areas remains equivalent, remains equal to each other. Why? Because we know that cyan, magenta and yellow, they're all deficient in some respect or the other. Cyan is contaminated with other inks. Cyan has deficiency in reflection. So we need to increase the percentage of cyan so that that deficiency is compensated. Similarly, so that in order to reduce the yellow and the red reflections from the yellow and magenta inks, etc., what we have to do, we have to reduce the dot percentage such that the overall deficiency that is obtained from the cyan ink is compensated by the lower reflections from the magenta and yellows, ensuring that the overall densities obtained through the different filters in that area remains equal, ultimately ensuring that that area can be called or can be visualized as a neutral gray area. Okay, so that means this assumption is very much important while doing this calculation. That means while calculating the equivalent neutral densities. Okay, now I think if we go to the previous slide where one picture I had showed you, if you remember that, it's a very interesting picture. If you can see this picture here, we had seen that the initially when we had mixed equivalent dot percentage, that means 50% cyan, 50% magenta, 50% yellow, we got a brownish we got a brownish gray. That means there was a color cast and thereby it was not a gray balanced image. But like in the example we saw where we are using 75% cyan, 60% magenta, 65% magenta, 60% yellow, here also we have increased kind of the percentages, dot percentages of cyan, decreased the dot percentage of magenta and that of yellow, to get what we can see over here is a neutral gray of a certain density value. So what is that? What is the difference now? What is the difference? Because you see it is deficient, cyan is deficient, and that has to be compensated. Here it was not compensated. That means the densities that we are obtaining through the magenta and yellow filter were much higher than the density that was obtained using the cyan filter, red filter. That means the cyan density was very low compared to the magenta and yellow densities, because cyan is deficient. So when we increase the cyan percentages while reducing the magenta and yellow dot percentages, the deficiency of cyan was overcome by the increased quantity with respect to the magenta and yellow. As a result of which, in this case, we are not increasing cyan really, but we are decreasing the magenta and yellow, whatever. That means since the percentage of cyan is higher than that of the magenta and yellow, its hue deficiencies or deficiencies in reflections is compensated by the lower reflections from magenta and yellow. That means the densities of magenta and yellow and cyan will be equal to each other. In this case, the densities of magenta and yellow are higher in comparison to cyan. In this situation, when it is gray balanced, the densities from the magenta and yellow, that means the green and the blue filter densities, will be equal to that of the red filter density, thereby ensuring that this resultant gray that is obtained is a neutral gray in nature. And this is how conventionally gray balance is achieved, and these percentages or these densities that we obtain from these different dot percentages, they are basically known as you can see, they are basically known as END, or equivalent neutral densities, for the three subtractive colors, for which when they overlap on each other, the resulting gray is a neutral gray and the entire image is gray balanced. Okay, so this is really the end of the lecture now. So hopefully whatever I have told you was clear, and I think that with this we come to the end in the gray balance component of the color reproduction. So we have achieved color reproduction using two things. or considering two things. The first is definitely we have reproduced the tones correctly, that means the contrast is correctly reproduced. That was our first goal. And the second goal was to reproduce the grays as neutral basically. That means we have reproduced an image having gray balance. So these were the two considerations while color correction work or while color reproduction, and we have achieved both those objectives using various techniques, using various methodologies, and we have analyzed certain problems and we have understood why those problems happen and how those problems can be solved. Okay, so this lecture ends over here, and in the next lecture we'll be talking in detail about the processes through which color reproduction work, color separation work, color reproduction work is done through direct process, indirect process, and through electronic color separation processes. And ultimately we'll end the series of in this particular module with some editing techniques, conventional editing techniques like dot etching, flat etching, retouching, all those things. So maybe in another 2 to 3 lectures we'll be able to complete this particular module on color. So thank you for listening, thank you for your attention. Meet you in the next lecture. Thank you.